Hello, this is Rose Tobin from Dublin in Ireland. Since 2014, I have been very privileged to be a Radical Forgiveness Master Coach. The presentation that you will see here is one that was given to a small group. We covered some of the basic concepts of Radical Forgiveness, the 5 stages, and more importantly, we explored the Radical Forgiveness Worksheet, which is a very powerful tool for releasing grievances and coming into greater empowerment. In the presentation, I referred often to what we call Jill's story, which is the first chapter of Colin's book on radical forgiveness. So it may be useful to refer to that if you have the book. So you see on the first slide here, a link to the Radical Forgiveness website, and also a photo of me with Colin and JoAnn Tipping on one of the training courses that I did with them. So just a little bit of background about radical forgiveness before we go into the presentation proper. If you're feeling out of balance, trapped, or experiencing emotional pain, and are looking for a way to move forwards, radical forgiveness is a powerful tool that will help you to transform your emotions and, in turn, your life. It will enable you to understand your feelings and uncover the beliefs, perceptions, and behavior that have been keeping you stuck. Through shifting your energies from anger and blame to forgiveness and responsibility, you'll be able to see things from a healthier perspective, not the limiting one of being a victim. Change your narrative by rediscovering yourself, using the Radical Forgiveness framework that has helped thousands around the world for over 25 years. We provide you with a toolkit and global support system to incorporate into your everyday life. Start your transformation to happiness and contentment today with Radical Forgiveness. And so we go on to the presentation proper. All right, so last week, or about 4 weeks ago now, we had an introductory session on forgiveness and general principles of forgiveness. And it really, I certainly believe, and I think most of you would believe, that nothing happens in our lives by accident. And everything can contain a lesson for us and contain riches for us at some level. And if things seem to happen to us on one level, if we're honest, we can see, well, maybe am I doing the same thing in another area? And so I had that experience with what happened in the whole chaos community. And I realized afterwards that while, I had been treated quite badly in many ways on the superficial, on the surface of it, that I had some similar attitudes myself. And I really knew that I could own that, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And in 2013, I downloaded Colin Tipping reading this book, Radical Forgiveness. The camera's not doing a great job, but he was reading an audiobook of it. And he said something like, these things that happen not to us, but for us. And that was a huge way of reframing what had happened. And he gave what I really liked about him is that he gave processes that you could use, because intellectually I knew this. I knew that there were lessons for me in what happened. I suppose had enough self-knowledge to realize that, but I didn't know what to do about it. So I practiced some of his processes and I found them very, very helpful. And I enrolled as a coach. And I now work with people with radical forgiveness, doing this process I'm going to show you today, but also other processes. Now, the great thing about the Radical Forgiveness Worksheet, which is the main thing I'm going to do today, is that it is something, if you get the idea of it, it is something you can do for yourself. I mean, if you want to come to a coach, you can have a session with me or a coach to bring you through if it's a very deep issue, but it is something that you can use as often as you like. It's very self-empowering. I gave a talk on radical forgiveness about 8 years to a meditation group. I did give them a talk on radical forgiveness, and I just gave them a copy of the worksheet. And I said, just take it with, because they'd all been into healing, so they had some understanding. And I said, just take it and see how you get on with it. And I still go to that group now. And some of them say they still do the worksheet. And a few of them had actually, by the time I met them about 2 months afterwards, some of them had done dozens of them on all sorts of issues in their life. And so they felt it was a very empowering way of handling situations. And what we say with any of the processes actually is the time to do them is when you feel triggered by something, when you feel an energy. And it isn't always a big thing. Right? It doesn't have to be what you think of the mega issues. You could be going along very calmly thinking you're grand and you're in control of your life, and somebody cuts across you in traffic or somebody's rude to you and you're feeling very upset and you get all worked up about it. And so what Colin says is they're the times you can do the processes. For many people, the very, very deep issues, especially if they're very, very deep issues like emotional issues that really do need the help of a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist, you do need to get that kind of support as well if they're very, very deep issues. But if there have been very deep issues in your life that are too much for you to look at, you can look at what seem to be the small issues that trigger you in everyday life, and you'll quite often find that they have a similar energy signature, but they're not as threatening. So you can always do these processes. You can do these processes many, many times in your life whenever you feel that you need them. So I'm just going to go into just the basic slides that I put together to give you an idea. Now, Radical Forgiveness, as I say, was created by Colin Tipping in collaboration with his wife, JoAnn. Colin was English. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was from Leicester in England. He was a hypnotherapist, among other things. And he and JoAnn had started to work with people with cancer. And they discovered that working with forgiveness was very, very helpful with people with serious illness. Sometimes it helped them to physically get better, but it also helped them to be kinder towards themselves as well. So he developed the processes. I think sometime in the 1990s. And his main work is this one here, Radical Forgiveness. He's also done Radical Self-Forgiveness, but today we'll focus on Radical Forgiveness because it is actually a little bit easier, believe it or not, to forgive somebody else than yourself quite often, even though ultimately all forgiveness comes back to the self anyway. But to get started, it's easier to do it on other people. All right, so why do we want to forgive? Now, we've talked about that before. If we don't forgive, if we're holding on to resentment, it's actually very toxic to us. This quote from Buddha, holding on to anger and resentment is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. And there are many versions of that. And if you've ever held on to an anger, a resentment, you realize what a toll it takes on your body. Especially if you're angry, for example. Even if you think of the concept for holding on to something, and if you're trying to hold on to something, it takes a lot of energy. You're gripping it and you're tense. So why we forgive is forgiveness is actually something it's almost something we do for our own benefit as much as the person we're forgiving. So it's realizing that holding on to resentment and anger is actually quite toxic for ourselves. So it can actually lead to more peace and happiness. It can lead to improving health, improved relationships, and more energy. Because again, if you think of all the energy it takes to be angry and resentful, when you begin to release a little bit of that energy, your system can relax and you have more energy to handle the things in front of you, as it were. And freedom from the past and from old patterns. So it definitely helps. And when I say, we will go into this in a minute again, but when we're saying forgiveness in terms of radical forgiveness, we're not saying that on the human level, what the person did was okay. So it's not condoning negative activity. If somebody stole from you, if somebody assaulted you, that is not on a human level all right. So we're not condoning bad behavior or illegal behavior. What we're doing is helping to release ourselves from holding on to the kind of emotional impact that's had on us. So, and for example, Colin, even in his book, he gives an example where there was a legal situation he had to deal with. And sometimes you do have to do things on a legal level or whatever. But if you do it from the place of calm, you're much more likely to get a better result, if nothing else. Whereas if you're going in with anger, you're not going to be thinking clearly. So it isn't that we have to become like doormats and let everybody walk all over us, but it lets go of the emotional charge so we can actually function in a more effective way. So that is important, because I think in common parlance, when people say, I will never forgive them, what they mean is, I know what they did was wrong and I'm not going to condone it. So it's a different thing. So how we know if we've forgiven somebody in the context we're talking about is if you can think about it, and it's not that you forget about it. So you don't have to have a blank slate of what happened, but you can think about it without charge, without getting yourself up in a knot about it. You can think about it, you can act rationally, but it isn't pulling you or wearing you out thinking about it. So we forgive for personal reasons. And it's like here, I like this one from Deepak Chopra. What we don't recognize is that holding on to resentment is like holding on to your breath. You'll soon start to suffocate. Okay, so it's a good way of putting it. And then on the collective level as well, it affects communities. So it can help to reconcile differences and old scores between people. There can be a lot of things like genetic issues, slavery going back generations, or generational issues in families, freedom from the past. And these can go on. These can be passed on from family to family, from generation to generation in families, and until somebody sort of does something to stop that, just to do something to change the energy around it. So when we forgive, again, with something like a racial issue or a slavery or any of these things, we're not denying that it happened. But if we're holding on, if we're still going to be angry with whoever the race we see as tormenting us, it's going to just be passed on and on and on. So it can affect communities. It's way beyond an individual benefit. And again, this is a nice one from Marianne Williamson. The practice of forgiveness is our most important contribution to the healing of the world. Okay, because it does bring peace. Okay, all right, so the next one here, these are just kind of introductions just to get a feel for it. In Radical Forgiveness, we distinguish between what's called traditional forgiveness and radical forgiveness. And just to bring a bit of humor, I love Irish Oscar Wilde. He says, after a good dinner, one can forgive anybody, even one's own relations. Okay. All right. And this one from C.S. Lewis is quite profound, because we can all say, forgiveness is a great idea. But everybody says it's a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. Okay. Because it isn't easy. All right. It isn't easy to forgive, even though every spiritual system worth its salt talks about forgiveness. Right? We know it's something we should do. And in a sense, because we know it's something that is good, and if we can't do it, we can actually feel worse. So the traditional forgiveness is things like letting bygones be bygones. And there's a benefit to that. So these are quite good in some ways. Some of these are quite good. Forgive and forget. You don't always have to forget, but you can certainly let go of it a little bit. But the thing is, nobody tells us how to do it. And sometimes, and I think this is where it gets a lot of people, is the trying to reconcile two conflicting energies. The part of you wants to forgive, but the other part of you wants to condemn what happened, because you do feel that whatever happened wasn't right. So it's like you're being pulled in two different directions. And then there's, of course, what's called extraordinary forgiveness. You see these examples where a mother might be able to forgive the murderer of her child, and they are so extraordinary that they get the headlines. Now, with radical forgiveness, it's very much what radical forgiveness is, a different perception in what happened. If you know the word radical, it means from the root. If you think of radishes, the vegetable radish, because it's a root vegetable. And radical means from the core, or from a very deep level. So it's a shift in perception. And now all of you here, I know, have a spiritual perspective, but even if people don't, if they're just willing to try it, often they will get a sense of it. But it's like maybe they didn't do it to me, but for me on some level. And even if I'm giving a talk to people who may not think that they're spiritual, and I'd say to them, if you think back of maybe your first maybe your first boyfriend or girlfriend, or maybe somebody who bullied you at school. Now, okay, it's not good that they did it, but when you look back, maybe that bully taught you how to stand up for yourself. Or maybe that first boyfriend or girlfriend, you learned an awful lot about how relationships work because of the breakup, if you like. So when you look back, sometimes you can see, even without the radical forgiveness perspective, that there may have been a lesson for you in what happened. It's easier to see in something that happened a good while ago and you've lost the charge about it. So seen from the big picture, whatever occurred maybe was meant to occur for your growth, and your higher self called it for it. Now, we're using the word higher self because that's a word most people are comfortable with. You can think of soul, you can think of your avatar, whatever. And there's no requirement that you be special, because I think people often think that only special people like saints could forgive, but you don't have to. I've done these processes with people of all sorts of backgrounds, very skeptical, very, 3D oriented people. You don't have to dig up the past. You can respond to people in the present. And that's really one good thing about it. As I said earlier, if you have something happening in the present and you feel yourself being rejected by somebody, you deal with that one right now. And that will help. If you think of, say, if you have a lot of sense of being rejected in your psyche, if you like, in your emotional makeup, and if you think of like a big iceberg, and if you deal with the situation in the present and actually just clear, at least you're clearing a little bit of that build up, if you like. And so it's not something you just do once. You might need to do these things several times, but it's very gentle. Now, it's virtually instantaneous. It's an energy process. So it happens quite quickly. Normally, when we bring people through the processes, they feel some shift. And I think those of you who attended the last time when I did the 13 steps, the audio program, that you might have felt a little bit of a shift. So it does happen fairly quickly, but it doesn't mean everything is sorted in one session. Okay, but you're clearing a little bit of whatever the issue is. So here we are just comparing the two. The traditional forgiveness is sometimes can be difficult. It can be sometimes seem to take a long time. You mightn't seem to be able to have any control over it. Whereas radical forgiveness goes to the core. And as I say, just remember, it's not condoning or denying what's happened, because I think that's a stumbling block for a lot of people with forgiveness. No relief required, which is really good. You just need to be willing to be open to the possibility. And I say to people, the very fact that you have even come to a session on radical forgiveness, or that you've come to a coach or whatever, means that you have that willingness to give it a go. It's easy to do, and it's step by step. All right, so just two more sort of background things before we kind of get into what we call the stages. Colin used to use this image that, I mean, he has the perspective from the soul perspective, the higher self perspective, that everything is really happening for our good. And I'm sure you can all feel that. At some level, there is a higher purpose to what's happening. And as he says, if you look at the back of a tapestry or anything, it looks chaotic and the stitches are all over the place. And it looks like there's little meaning, there's mistakes. And often, if without a higher perspective in our lives, life can seem like the back of a tapestry. It can seem chaotic and random. And I'm sure we've all felt that. At times you don't know why anything is happening, little meaning, and you can get caught up in your victim stories. It can seem to be very random and very chaotic. And I think that happens with most people until they have some kind of shift or spiritual awakening, or could come through if they're going to a wise therapist, that can happen as well. So we begin to see that there is a meaning to what happens. But for a lot of people, they can be in this state of feeling that life is random and chaotic. Whereas when we start to work with any genuine spiritual growth, I don't think it's just radical forgiveness at all. But when we start to get a broader perspective on our lives, you begin to think that everything that might have seemed random actually has a place. And if the craziness that happened 20 years ago hadn't happened, you wouldn't be where you are now. And I'm sure you can all look back on things that seemed absolutely crazy at the time. and you look back, my God, that was a turning point for me in some way. Or if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have met so-and-so, or I wouldn't have found that book or whatever. So life is meaningful in the spiritual sense. And from that perspective, there are no accidents or mistakes, even though they could have seemed crazy at the time. All right, so just want to go into a little bit of theory, if you like. All of the processes of radical forgiveness touch on these stages. The first one is a very important one, especially when we are spiritually oriented, and we know on one level that everything is happening for good. We know on one level, we can intellectually say there are no victims. I know I'm not a victim. But if we are feeling charged or upset, we've got to be honest that we actually do in that moment feel that we are the victim of some situation. So it isn't about, Colin would talk about this, and I'm sure Phil has come across this idea too, that the idea of, so we're not going to do what's called a spiritual bypass. We're not going to be so holy that we never get angry, or that we sprinkle fairy dust over our hurt or whatever, or pink, or we send it to the angels or whatever. We are honest in the fact that if I feel in this moment upset about something, I am upset, and I am in a victim consciousness, and I'm not going to get out of that in a healthy way unless I acknowledge where I am. So I'm sure that makes sense to you. All right. So what we do, we have a need to tell the story and have it witnessed and validated. Now, if you're coming to a coach, you would tell the story to the coach. But in the worksheet that we're going to do, the way you tell the story is you write it down for yourself. So you write it and then you read it out loud. So you're just being clear about what it is that you're upset about. And you're witnessing and validating it for yourself if you're doing it on your own. And most people can do an awful lot of this on their own. If it's a very deep issue, you can have coaching, and that can be very helpful as well. But it is very important that you are either tell the story. And the second one is equally important, if not more so, because especially again, for people with a spiritual orientation, they can be uncomfortable with acknowledging what they call negative emotions, or depending on what culture you come from too. In some cultures, from what I know, say, for example, the Latin culture, I mean, everybody just expresses their emotions all over the place, and that's no problem. But if you come from a culture where you don't, or traditionally in certainly the culture I live here in Ireland, it's more difficult for men, for example, to acknowledge their feelings. So if you have, so it is important to allow yourself to feel the feelings. Now, with radical forgiveness, it isn't that you have to get into deep emotional processing at all. You just have to be willing to acknowledge that I am upset, I'm hurt, I'm angry, I'm even feeling vengeful, I am feeling annoyed. And the fact that you are able to admit that means you're much less likely to act on that feeling, because it's when feelings are unacknowledged or are kind of repressed, we're much more likely to do something damaging to others or to ourselves. But if we can admit that I'm hurt, I'm upset, I feel neglected, I feel abandoned, or whatever it is, then we're much more likely to be able to heal it. So you can't heal it if you don't feel. But as I say, most of the time, it isn't heavy feeling. You might feel a bit tearful, but that's fine. And let yourself have a little cry. If it's any deeper, then you may need to go to somebody who's qualified to deal with deep emotions. But for the ordinary things that I work with people, it's just acknowledging them, and for somebody to say to you, it's okay if you feel these things. That doesn't make you a bad person. So there's no such thing as a negative feeling, in the sense that we can have especially again, it happens in spiritual circles where people feel they have to be positive all the time, and they can kind of suppress the negative feelings, and sometimes that comes across in a kind of a monotone of a voice that's very sweet and doesn't get angry, and underneath the sweetness you can feel there's something that's not being expressed. So in terms of what Colin is talking about, it's not negative. to feel angry or upset. Once you're not acting it out on anybody else, you're being honest. And mental forgiveness, it's a bit strong, but he said it was pseudo forgiveness, just forgiving somebody in your head. I think it does do something, but it isn't as strong as if you allow yourself to acknowledge the feeling. And so spiritual bypass, he often talked about that people could, try to be so spiritual in a different context. I remember a teacher I had once said, beware of being so heavenly that you're no earthly use. Okay. And often we can want to be very spiritual and not deal with the messiness, if you like, of life, which is part of life. So those are the first two stages. And as I say, each of the processes touches on those. It's to a bigger or lesser degree. The shorter processes just quickly, and the longer ones go into the more deeply. So we go into the next one, where what we call collapsing the story. And we'll be looking at this in the worksheet. And that is where you begin to separate the fact from the interpretation that you have made up of the. I hope most of you have probably had a chance to read Jill's story. If you haven't, it's in the story. Jill, who is Colin's sister, is very upset because her husband has become much less loving to her. And so and then it goes back to apparently their father, who wasn't a bad man at all, but their father was just very typical. If you think of Colin, if he was still alive, would be 80. So his father would have been, born 130 years ago. People weren't emotionally expressive in those days. And so he was a loving man in one way, but he wasn't a cuddly, loving kind of a man, if you like. And so Jill, as a child, misinterpreted it, that her father didn't love her, that she wasn't enough for her father and she could never please him. So collapsing the story in that sense is beginning to separate the fact from the interpretation that she has made up about the fact. And for example, Colin pointed out that even though his father wasn't that cuddly type of father, he had spent hours coming up to Christmas making a special doll's house for her. And that was the way he expressed his love, but it wasn't in the way that she wanted to. So her interpretation was that he didn't love her, which wasn't actually true. He didn't love her in the way she wanted to be. So we begin to look and see, have we got unreasonable expectations of people? And that can be very humbling. Sometimes you realize you're expecting an awful lot of people. Somebody is late for a lunch meeting, and you assume it's because they have no respect for me and they're neglecting me and all the rest of it. And they could actually have something really significant could have delayed them. All right. But we can make it about us. So sometimes we want somebody to be different, and a lot of our suffering comes from our interpretation. We can very much take things very personally and think that it's all about us. So it helps us to exercise compassion and mercy. This often happens when I work with people and they're working on their parents. And, as a child, you see your parent just as a parent and you only see them in that light. And sometimes it's very helpful to encourage people to see their parents in the context of the environment in which they grew up. Many people's parents might have grown up during a war, or their father or mother may have gone through a war. So they've been brought up in a very different environment. And if you begin to see that, have a bit of compassion for a family member who had a very difficult time and maybe just wasn't capable of expressing the type of love that you might have liked to experience. So it does begin to sift out the facts from the interpretations of the facts. Then we come to the fourth stage, and we'll spend some time on this when we do the worksheet, which is the reframe. And again, this is used, the reframing is used in other types of psychological systems as well. But the reframe is where we begin to, if you think of the tapestry, right? We're turning the tapestry over and seeing the situation from maybe the perspective, if you like, of our higher self. Or if you think it's an image we often hear about, that in a sense we all have our own drama playing, as it were. And the higher part of us is like the movie director assigning parts to us and everybody else in our drama for our learning. So the reframe is beginning to sense that there might be something else going on in the situation that we're going through. And sometimes people won't see it, and that's okay. There is reframe language, which I will show you. Sometimes you'll see it, okay, what's going on. So you're willing to even the willingness is to see the perfection, and you don't have to believe it. You can almost be just, I'm willing to see that there may be something happening here that's bigger than I can see right now. That's enough willingness, if you like. And Colin says you fake it till you make it, but you could at least willing to see, okay, I'm willing to see that maybe something else is happening in this situation. There may be a higher purpose, and that this person and I are, he says, doing a healing dance with each other. This person and I may be reflecting things to each other that we can learn from, or whatever way you want to put it, okay? And then the final one, which actually permeates all of the stages, is the integration. The new story needs to be anchored. So it's not just like with the processes, you don't just think them, except for the very short one that I'd introduced you to. But with a worksheet, for example, you actually write it down and you say it out loud. And if you remember the 13 steps I did with you the last session, I asked you to just say yes, to use your voice. So you need to do something physical. You could do artwork. I mean, if you want to, you can do breath work, drawing, walking, writing. You get it into the physical body. So it needs to be anchored, and it makes it much more real. So in a sense, the integration is happening right throughout, especially with the worksheet, because you're going to be writing. Now, not here today, but if you're doing the worksheet, you actually write it. And I suggest, it's up to yourself, but I think when you're doing the worksheet, you could get a version online. I think the website has them. But personally, I feel it's a little bit more powerful if you actually write with a pen on using your body. I think you get a bit more out of it. But some people just like to do them online. Okay, so we're getting onto the tools now shortly, because that's the main thing I want to do with you. And there are many, many, many different tools. And as I say here, they all bring you through these 5 stages. So if you get a sense of the 5 stages, and you'll kind of see the structure of all of the worksheets, or not just the worksheets, but all of the processes, which gives you a sense of that they all are doing basically the same thing. Some of them go a bit more deep than others. So the Radical Forgiveness Worksheet, which is the one I'm going to just introduce you to today, the quick forgiveness worksheet, which I shared with you. And once you've done the long one, you'll have no problem with that. And as it says, it's a quicker one if it's not a major issue, or if you don't have a long time to do it. You can do the quick worksheet. The self-forgiveness, I think it would be worth doing another session on that one, because self-forgiveness worksheet, self-forgiveness can be harder for most of us, but it's well worth looking at that one. The 4 steps, which is the quick one, and I'll do that again. And then the 3 letters, I won't go into it now, but the 3 letters process is doing the same thing. But as it says, you write 3 letters. Now, it's usually better to do this with a coach. But what you would do in the first letter is write your victim story. And you can really, you don't have to be polite. And actually, that's one thing with these, especially when you're doing it on your own, or even with a coach, you don't have to be nice if you're doing the victim part. If you need to use strong language, do. Okay, because it's helping you to express the emotions. So the first letter would be very much the victim, and you really just you're completely the victim of this person. You write it to them, and it's not an aggressive thing to do, because what you're doing when you do forgiveness work on anybody, you are freeing them from the effect of you projecting all this anger onto them. Because if you've been angry with somebody for the last 10 years, every time you think of them, you're pulsing a bit of anger. You're kind of affecting them at some level. So if you take care of your part and cut that cord, if you like, you're freeing them as well from the effect of you holding this against them for so long. So the 3 letters, the first one is to the person, you're the victim. The second one is more like the traditional forgiveness. And I've done a lot of this with people, with parents. And this is where you might say to them, have you any idea of what your family background was? And, usually they'll know that some of these patterns have gone background. So they begin to realize that their mother or father wasn't just their mother or father. They were the product of their own upbringing. They had other things going on in their life when they were parents as well. So you begin to get a sense, okay, maybe there was more going on, and my parents, maybe you did your best, even though it wasn't what I would have liked. So you get a bit of compassion for the parent. So it's a bit like the traditional, or you could put yourself in their shoes, basically. And usually then by the 3rd letter, and we usually get people to wait 2 days between each of these. And by the 3rd letter, then you ask them to begin to see, and it usually happens through the process, that they begin to see, gosh, yeah, I realize, Mum or Dad, that I've learned an awful lot because of this, the situation with you. And it can be quite beautiful sometimes, the letters that people write. Okay, and then there are the 13-step processes, which are the oral ones. They're audio processes. And they are available, some of them are available on audible.com. So they're ones where you will be talked through the process. So I just want to get on now, because the main thing we wanted to do today is the Radical Forgiveness Worksheet. If you get a handle on this, the rest of the processes make an awful lot of sense. And as I say, this is something, you have the file, you can make as many copies as you like. And if you like it, you'll find it, you're very likely to find it very, very helpful. So if you see at the left side there, I've divided it into sections so I can share it more easily on the PowerPoint. But if you see here, the first part is kind of telling the story. You see that? And then the second part would be feeling the feelings. And then we'll go on here to the next one. It'll tell you what the third part is, right? Collapsing the story. So we'll go back to the first part. And when you're doing this, we're going to do it in reference to Jill's story in a minute. But when you're doing it yourself, is you just literally describe the situation you're upset about. So whatever it is, it could be, say, somebody rude to you, somebody didn't turn up. And in the first one, you're talking about the person in the third person. So like, John didn't turn up, or so-and-so did this, that, and the other. So you're just talking about the situation as you would describe it maybe to a friend. And you allow yourself to be a victim. And you may need, if it's a big story, you may need more paper. And just to let yourself write it out until you feel you've written enough. So an extra piece of paper might be handy. If it's a very simple situation, a few sentences are enough. What I find is, if I'm doing this with people, they will have often told me the whole story. And then I might just get them to write 2 or 3 sentences just to summarize it. So you just do this, your situation around which I have an upset is or was. So it could be something going back a while. It could be something very current. And then you confront, and again, confronting is a very strong word, but you're just directly speaking to the person. I'm upset with you, Mom, or I'm upset with you, John, because, yeah, maybe I'll just look at it in terms of Jill's story. So the first one would be, if you read Jill's story, around I've upset was that Jeff is behaving, who is her husband, he's behaving very strangely. He's giving far more attention to his daughter than he is to me, and I feel neglected, or whatever it was she said, something like that. And then, so she would be confronting Jeff, and she's, I'm upset with you, Jeff, because you're ignoring me. You're making me feel I'm not enough. I feel that, I just want to leave you, or whatever it is. Okay. So you just allow the person to express how they're feeling. And then again, this is with the victim standpoint, because you might have the higher self, if you're spiritually aware, saying, I know it's not about him, it's about me. But for this point, it works better if you acknowledge where you are right now. So because of what you did, and Jill would have said, like, I feel neglected, I feel not good enough, I feel annoyed, I feel abandoned, whatever it is. And even if it's things like you feel might be very negative. I mean, if somebody's really hurt you, you might feel like you might feel vengeful towards them. It's better to acknowledge that, because then you'll be able to do something about it. Okay. So you can be as strong as you like. So you just write down. And as I'm saying this, you might even be able to think of a situation. And I would suggest, you obviously don't have to, but over the next day or two, just print out one of these and do it on somebody. So because of what you did, I feel, and identify your real emotions. So again, it's not about playing nice. Now, we acknowledge our humanness, and this one is a really important one. I just wanted to say here, if you see these little boxes here where they say willing, open, skeptical, unwilling, the only willingness that's required of you in radical forgiveness is to do the process. That's the most important willingness. When you're looking at these, you don't have to tick willing all the time. So, because sometimes people think they do. So, for example, I lovingly recognize and accept my feelings and judge them no more. I am entitled to my feelings. Now, if you really feel very unwilling, write that. I'm not entitled, or I can't accept those feelings, or whatever. Be unwilling. Be honest. So some people might just be open. They're not really willing, but they're open. So just, again, be very honest about it. And the same thing here. I own my feelings. No one can make me feel anything. My feelings are a reflection of how I see the situation. Now, for somebody very new to this, they might think this is absolute nonsense. And so they might say unwilling, and that's okay. All right. But I think most of us would begin to see really, we can certainly say it, even if we don't always believe it, that nobody can make me feel anything. At the same time, you know what he did to me, and you know we contradict ourselves until we are fully clear. But so it's here. I own my feelings. No one can make me feel anything. My feelings are a reflection of how I see the situation, because it really is. It's how we are interpreting the situation is usually where we're suffering. So the next bit, then, I'm sure you can see that that's all relatively pretty straightforward to do. So then my discomfort was my signal that I was withholding love for myself and whoever you are doing the process on. By judging, holding expectations, wanting whoever it is to change, and seeing them as less than perfect. Now, we're talking about perfect in the whole sense, that seeing them as, if you like, an expression of source, or seeing them as worthy in their own right, as it were. Okay, their behavior may not have been perfect, but so your discomfort is your signal that you're, at some level, you're withholding love. Say if you're doing, as so many people do them on their parents. So I'm withholding love from myself and my mother or mum by judging, holding expectations, wanting mum to change, and seeing mum as less than perfect. Because, and the higher, where we're looking at this from the reframe, she may have been the perfect mother for you to learn your spiritual lessons, even if she wasn't the perfect mother. She wasn't the textbook perfect mother on human terms, okay? So then when you look at the judgments, expectations, and behaviors that indicate that you are wanting her or him to change, all right? So again, if it's a parent, she should always have been there for me, or he should always, like Jill, he should have had me in his lap and chatted to me and cuddled me and played with me. So, and as we saw in Jill's story, what really got her is that she saw her father, when she was a bit older, she saw her father making a fuss of one of his grandchildren in a way that he never made a fuss of her. All right, so that's really what upset her. So you look to see, and so you begin to see the behaviors that you are judging the other person for. And quite often, it's not even things that are, even in human terms, bad things. It's just that they're not the way we want them to be. And then sometimes, if you're willing to look at this, you may see that you are making some of those judgments about yourself as well. I can remember doing this once when I thought, he's so arrogant, you know. I thought, okay, I began to see, all right, maybe a little bit, you know, a little bit is that in me. So sometimes it can take courage. This can take courage, because you can sometimes cringe and say, okay, all right, maybe, all right, it might be as arrogant as he is, but still, you know, maybe there's a little bit, or whatever the thing is you're talking about. And I'm sure that makes sense to you. I mean, quite often what we say about other people is very revealing about what's in ourselves. Okay, so not everybody's willing to look at this little bit, how many judgments and expectations they're making about themselves. If it was somebody's first time doing this, I wouldn't push that at all. But people sometimes can say, okay, maybe I'm doing that too. You know, maybe I am a bit impatient as well, or maybe I am a bit demanding, maybe a little bit. So even a little bit, if they can see it. Okay. Now, this is a nice little thing that Colin has. I would recommend you getting his book. It's very easily available on Amazon or any of those places. And for example, with the feelings, you can allow yourself just, you know, I ask for support. This was a little, almost like a prayer he gave in the book, which you could I ask for support in feeling love for each of my emotions just the way it is, as I embrace it within my heart and accept it lovingly as part of myself. Because if you reject the emotions, they're just going to go underground. So, okay, I accept the fact that I'm angry or that I'm jealous, and I love that part of me, because when you love it, it relaxes. All right, so that's the first part. And then the next one is what's called collapsing the story. And that is where you begin to look at the interpretations that you made. So again, if we look at, well, I'll read the bit first. When you're doing this yourself, you would read what's here in the printed text out loud as well. So you'd say, I now realize that in order to feel the experience more deeply, my soul has encouraged me to create a bigger story out of the event or situation than it actually seemed to warrant, considering just the facts. This purpose having been served, I can now release the energy surrounding my story by separating the facts from the interpretations I have made up about it, and list the main interpretations, circle the level of emotion and attachment you have now. So, for example, in Jill's story, she interpreted her father's, he was just a naturally reserved man, as many men of his generation and his nationality were. And so she interpreted that as that he didn't love her. So I'm sure we've all done that kind of thing. So the interpretation I made is, Dad didn't love me because he wasn't cuddly or whatever it was. And you can then, the level of emotion, if it's something that's very charged, allow yourself to say, yeah, there is a lot of emotion around that now. And, or whatever else she might have had there. So whatever interpretations, I'm sure you can look back and sometimes you see you're interpreting things about an event, often, especially when we're younger, or when we're in a victim mode, we're actually in quite like a child, we're like in our child self in a sense, right? We're not being the adult if we're very much in our victim mode. And children often, they really think the world in a sense revolves around them. They think everything's about them to some extent. And so often when people behave in a way that when we're in that emotional self, we take it very, very personally. And if you even remember in the 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, and one of the agreements is not to take things personally, because very rarely what other people do very rarely has anything to do with us, unless it's very, very rarely. They even if they act unkindly to us, it may not be that they want to be unkind to us. They may be having a very bad day. They may be very worried. Like a very simple thing could be somebody you think you know well, and they walk past you on the street and they don't smile, and you think, oh, they're mad with you or they're upset with you. Now, it could be a few things. They may not have their contact lenses in. They may not have seen you, okay? Or they could be very worried about something and just preoccupied. And it had nothing to do with you. And you make up, I'm saying you, I've done this, make up a whole story about it. And you realize that the interpretation I made up had nothing to do with them at all. Very little to do with them. So I'm sure you can see the point of that. So you write down whatever interpretations you have made up about that. And so that's acknowledging that how I'm telling the story, okay, the facts may be true on one level, but a lot of the emotion and interpretation I put into it, it's not really the full story. And it sometimes takes a bit of humility sometimes to admit that. Now, this is an interesting one. So I'm sure that's all makes sense to people. This is an interesting one. And this is about our core negative beliefs that are either driving the story or we have assumed from the story. So, for example, Jill, from the fact that her father was cuddly with his granddaughter, but not with her, she made up the interpretation that she wasn't enough, or that she wouldn't be good enough for a man, or that kind of thing. So the core negative beliefs, and you can go through these. Now, honestly, I have hardly worked with anybody who doesn't have that first one. Most of us have a little bit of, I will never be enough. Okay, nearly everybody I have worked with is feel I will never be enough. I feel sometimes I'm going to create myself an alter ego or an alter name if I'm writing, call myself Mrs. Enough, like E and then N-U-F-F, Mrs. Enough, because so few people feel that they are enough. I'm sure most of you here would take that one off as well. Many people think it's not safe to be me, whatever that means. I'm always last or left out. Jill would certainly have felt that in that situation, that she was being left out of the dynamics between her husband and her husband's daughter, or when she was a child, or indeed even with the first husband. People always abandon me. That's a very common one. All right? People always abandon me. And you can think of an example Colin used to give that, say if you have a little girl and she's daddy's princess, and then maybe she has a temper tantrum one day, and the next day daddy's gone. Now, what she doesn't know is that the parents have broken up. Or maybe the daddy has gone off to war. But she may interpret daddy being gone is that she was naughty. She had a temper tantrum. He's gone because of her, and she's been abandoned by her father. So the child will make an interpretation that often isn't valid. But that's a very common one. It's not safe to speak out, another very common one. I should have been a boy or girl. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything with gender in terms of being transgender. What this can mean sometimes, and I have worked with some people either way, that maybe there were 3 boys in the family and the mother wanted a girl, a daughter, or the other way around. There were 3 girls and the father wanted a boy. And so they've always grown up with that thing that they should have been the other gender. So that's one that come up. No matter how hard I try, it's never enough. Very common one again. Life's not fair. It's not good to be powerful, successful, rich, or outgoing. I mean, I've worked with a client who's exceptionally wealthy, and she still has this issue dealing with being very wealthy. I am unworthy. I'm sure most of you say, okay, I've certainly, if I don't feel them now, I have felt them. I don't deserve. I must obey or suffer. Again, a very common one. Others are more important than me. Certainly, Jill in that story would have felt that. I am alone. Very common. No one will love me. I am unlovable. No one is there for me. And if you have another one, that you can put that in as well. So all you need to do is just note them. And Colin just had some lines here that from the book, which I just printed out here. Life will always prove your beliefs right. I'm sure you found that sometimes, have you? You know, if you believe in something, you seem to attract it to yourself. Like there are people who really believe that they don't deserve to be, have money. And so it'll almost create situations where they get cheated or get embezzled or whatever. We always create our reality according to our beliefs. We nearly always take things personally, especially when we're very young. And another thing he says, there are no problems, only misperceptions. It's the way we perceive things quite often. In the normal course of events, I'm not talking about really, really serious, heavy things, but in the normal course of events, it's often our misinterpretations. So I'm sure that makes sense to you. Now, if you're doing this in the worksheet, you'll get this done very quickly. I'm just spending time on it. Then the next one is opening to a reframe. And this is acknowledging, and again, if people are skeptical, that is fine, but you just say, I now realize that my soul encouraged me to form these beliefs in order to magnify my sense of separation so I could feel it more deeply for my spiritual growth. One of the perspectives that Colin has is that we are, and I ascribe to it as well, that on the level of source, the level of God, we are all one, we're all perfect. And sometimes we learn something, we learn more about the quality, say, of love by sometimes experiencing its opposite, right? We learn by learning the opposite, even in a very simple way. If you are very physically fit, you can take that for granted. Now, if you break your leg and you're out of action for 6 weeks, and then you can walk again, it feels like a whole new thing. Oh my God, I can walk again. It's amazing. And you appreciate it. There was a line from Joni Mitchell's song where she sang, don't it always seem to go, that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. So there's that kind of thing. Colin would posit that coming into this existence or into materialization is a way for us to experience separation so that we can relearn what it is to love and to be one. And we appreciate it far more. So that's the context of here. So he says, I realized that my soul encouraged me to form these beliefs in order to magnify my sense of separation so I could feel it more deeply to my spiritual growth. You don't have to ascribe to that if you don't want to, but I think we do learn. This is a great school. I mean, if you think of a place where you could learn about all aspects of separation and pain, etc., Earth is a brilliant school in that sense. As I now begin to remember the truth of who I am, I give myself permission to let them go. And I now send love and gratitude to myself and whoever it is I'm forgiving for creating this growth experience. Now, not everybody is ready to do that yet, but I still encourage them to put the person's name down. So for Jill, it would be Jeff. And if it's very new to people, or if there's a very strong sense of resentment, they can be unwilling, and that is fine. But often you begin to think, okay, all right, maybe there's something going on here. The other thing that can be very helpful is noticing patterns. And one of these things is beginning to ask us, say it in Jill's case, Colin talked to her and began to say, well, okay, you think Jeff is neglecting you now. You thought the same thing with Dad. And then he kind of got her to think of her first husband. and the very same dynamic, played out in a different way. The first husband was promiscuous, very unfaithful to her, but it was the same kind of dynamic, that she wasn't enough. So begin to see that there are patterns, that this has happened several times in my life, which you begin to think, oh God, maybe it isn't about the other person at all. Because you think, well, what's the common denominator? If I notice this has happened 3 or 4 times at least in my life, and who's the common denominator? Me. Okay. So you begin to realize, okay, is it something? And it's not about beating yourself up. I mean, that can be the initial thing. Oh God, stupid me. There I go again. But it's actually, when we go through the process, it's actually empowering. So for Jill then, for example, I recognize my spiritual intelligence has created stories in the past that are similar to circumstances and feeling to this one, in order to magnify the emotional experience of separation that my soul wanted. I am seeing this as evidence that even though I don't know why or how, my soul has created this particular situation too, in order that I learn and grow. So you just, similar stories and feelings as in 2B. 2B was where you put in your feelings. So if it was neglect or abandonment, well, where else did you feel abandoned? And you might remember other things. You might have felt abandoned by your best friend or whatever. You may think, you may come across, and you know, if you're really thinking, you probably will come across 3 or 4 little incidents there. So that you've just put willing, skeptical, etc. All right. So that is the first page if you have your worksheet printed out. And then we go on to the second page. Now, these are quick ones, but they're important. Now, this is what's called, if you see on the left there, it's telling you it's towards the reframe. So I now realize that I get upset only when someone resonates in me, those parts of me that I have disowned, denied, repressed, and then projected onto them. I see now the truth in the adage, if you spot it, you've got it. I don't know if you've heard that expression. That works for good things too, by the way. If you notice how loving somebody is or how kind they are, it's because there's something in you that you recognize it, because that's a quality that you have as well. So it works both ways. But like me, you know, a person is arrogant. I think, okay, if I spot it, I've got it. So where is, you know, you have to kind of cringe and say, all right, maybe a little bit. So you've just been willing to see it's me in the mirror. Okay. And it may not be obvious. An example I use sometimes is, for example, if somebody has stolen from you, literally stolen something physical like money or jewelry or whatever it is, and you come to this and you say, but I don't steal things. I'm not a thief. But it might be more subtle. What's another way of stealing? If you steal somebody's reputation by spreading gossip about them, or if you are in a company and somebody comes up with a very good idea, you hear it and you pass it on as your own. That's a kind of a stealing as well. So sometimes the part may be less obvious, but it's usually there at some level. Okay. So again, willing, open, skeptical, unwilling, etc. And then whoever it is you're doing the worksheet on. So whoever it is reflecting what I need to love and accept in myself. And thank you, whoever it is, for this gift. Now, if this again is somebody's first time doing this, or if they're very new to this way of thinking, they say, what? And they can put unwilling. Okay. But I think most of us, when you come to this, you begin to realize, okay, there's something else happening. And maybe on the soul level, this person loves me enough to be the punching bag for my stuff. I don't know if that makes sense to you. Okay. He loves me enough, or she loves me enough to play the bad guy in my drama, if you like. So even though I may not understand it all, I now realize that you and I have both been receiving exactly what we each had subconsciously chosen, and we're doing a dance with and for each other to bring us to a state of awakened consciousness. And again, be honest. If you don't believe it, that's fine. I now realize that nothing you have done is either right or wrong. Now we're talking again on the spiritual level. Okay, if somebody's stolen from you or physically attacked you, of course that's not right. But in terms of the drama playing out, it may have a higher purpose. I am able now to release the need to blame you or anyone else. I release the need to be right about this, and I'm willing to see the perfection of the situation just the way it is. It doesn't mean that you do see it. You're at least willing, and that's all you need to know. I'm willing to see that for whatever reason, my mission or soul contract included having experiences like this, and that you and I may have agreed to do this dance with and for each other in this lifetime. If it is for the highest good for both of us, I now release you and me from that contract. And it doesn't mean you're releasing them from the contract. In other words, you're never going to see them again, unless that's what's happened. But it means the contract of playing that particular dynamic with them. I released from my consciousness all feelings of, and that was the feelings you had in 2B. I worked with a lady recently who had a lot of issues around her mother. Mothers are the most common one I do this with, but she had something around her mother, and her mother wasn't this, that, and the other. And this young woman seems to be a very good mother herself, and she felt that her own mother was kind of making remarks about her, and that, and I got a sense that the mother, her mother, felt a bit threatened by the fact that her own daughter maybe was a more loving mother to her child than she had been able to be. And what I suggested to her, actually, I said, it might help. I think your mother's a bit threatened by this, and she's kind of covering up for that by being critical. And I suggested to her, she didn't have to do it, but I suggested, why don't you, one thing might be good is to think of something good your mother did. Now, even the worst mother has done something good. Think of something good and kind of convey that to her. When the next time you see her, remember, Mom, the time you did this and the other. So she wrote to me, and she said what she did was, the next time the mother was there, that she was with her mother, she said to her, Mom, I used to love when you brought me to Dublin for Christmas shopping. And so they talked about that for a little while. And her mother relaxed, because she thought, at least I did something right. Okay. So sometimes it can help you to realize that, okay, the person mightn't have been perfect from your perspective, but maybe they did some things right. And that can be helpful. So we're coming now to the final part. And I hope all this makes sense. And I'm kind of going through it. Oh, yeah, I just want you to introduce the reframe language. If you have it as a file there, this is language that Colin put into the quick worksheet. And I won't read every one of them, but you have it there. Now, if you're coming to the reframe and you really have no idea what the higher purpose of it is or what the spiritual lesson is, you can use some of this generic language to help you. So, for example, this is just the first one, even though I may not understand how or why, I am now willing to recognize that my soul has created this situation for my spiritual growth. So even if you can't think of anything else, or I'm now willing to release my need to judge the situation as right or wrong, good or bad, or I am now willing to be open to the idea that this person is helping me reconnect with my true nature and access the power within myself, etc. And there's more here. And so you might find that some of these, this one is a good one, number 11. I let go of my need to make whoever it is. So Jill might write, I let go of my need to make Jeff responsible for my unhappiness. And we do that so much, don't we? We make other people responsible for how we are. Okay. So they're just some reframe language that you can use. So we're coming to the reframe, which is the radical forgiveness part, as it were. And so it says this, and again, when you are doing this, you would read what's in the text out loud, as well as what you write. That's part of the integration. So the story in box 1 was your victim story, based in the old paradigm of reality, victim consciousness. Now attempt a different perception of the same event, a reframe from your new empowered position, based on the insights you've experienced as you proceeded through this worksheet. Now, as I said, now maybe just a generic statement, especially for people who are not used to this way of thinking, that might be enough. But if you are aware, for example, in Jill's story, she may be I now realize, Jeff, that you're reflecting back to me my own feelings of unworthiness, and that you were the perfect person to reflect this back to me, or whatever it might be. Now, he does say not to do a reframe that's based in world of humanity terms. So that might mean you just on the normal everyday thing, So I can now realize that our marriage will be fine now because I've understood all of this. And that's your world of humanity terms, which is fine too. But I now realize that the way you were acting was perfect for me to learn, to reflect back to me that I didn't feel as if I was enough. Because if Jeff had been perfectly loving to her, she wouldn't have touched on that belief in herself. All right, so that's the reframe. And Colin, if you get his book, in chapter 21, it goes in great detail on the worksheet. So this is the final part. And these are lovely. When I'm doing these with people in sessions, I actually read these out loud to them. but you can read it out loud to yourself. So I completely forgive myself, your name, and accept myself as a loving, generous, and creative being. I release all need to hold on to emotions and ideas of lack and limitation connected to the past. I withdraw my energy from the past and release all barriers against the love and abundance that I know I have in this moment. I create my life, and I am empowered to be myself again, to unconditionally love and support myself just the way I am, in all my power and magnificence. To say, I read this to people, actually, and let them to that they receive it. It's a lovely, and I'm reading it really fast now, but if you're reading for yourself, read it really beautifully and slowly. And then I now surrender to the higher power I think of, whatever that is. Okay, for some people it's God. Not everybody's comfortable with God. It can be source, the universe, whatever it is. And trust in the knowledge that this situation will continue to unfold perfectly and in accordance with divine guidance and spiritual law. I acknowledge my oneness and feel myself totally reconnected with my source. I am restored to my true nature, which is love, and I now restore love to whoever it is. So Jill would write Jeff. I close my eyes in order to feel the love that flows in my life and to feel the joy that comes when the love is felt and expressed. So as to say, when I do that with people, I read those two to them, so they can receive them as a kind of meditation. I mean, you could use those as kind of affirmations for yourself anyway, apart from doing the worksheet. So then you will come now, often, especially I think when we're more spiritually aware, often when you get to this point, you begin to realize that whoever you're forgiving has actually done you a service on some level, has been a teacher for you, a reflection for you. So quite often you might actually feel a bit of appreciation for them. So appreciation to you. So Jeff, it was Jill writing, Jeff, having done this worksheet, I now realize that you were a perfect person to reflect my lack of love, whatever way you want to put it, okay? But you will get a sense that you might get a sense, and you just trust what you get. And then I completely forgive you, whoever you are, Jeff, for I now realize that you did nothing wrong and everything is in divine order. I bless you for being willing to play a part in my awakening. Thank you, and honor myself for being willing to play a part in your awakening. I acknowledge and accept you just the way you are. So you're seeing each other as playing a dance. And this one I think is a very important one, because certainly if I'm very charged when I do these, and as I say, by the time I got through this, I realized, oh my God, it was me. And I was projecting all this onto them. All right. It wasn't about them at all. And you can almost feel a little bit embarrassed in your own mind that I was throwing all this stuff in my head at them. And really it was about me. I don't know if you can identify with that. I know if you've ever had that when you realize, oh God, it was me. So what I often find myself doing here is actually acknowledging my courage. I know to myself, it's very brave. Well done. It's brave to do this. It's a lot of integrity to look at yourself directly, or whatever it is you feel. But I often do feel that was brave, because it isn't easy. We can be very attached to our perceptions of ourselves. I recognize that I'm a spiritual being having a spiritual experience in a human body, and I love and support myself in every aspect of my humanness. It's kind of based on the quote by Teilhard de Chardin, the French philosopher. Okay, so I mean, we don't, because we've gone on quite long. I mean, ideally we'd have time to chat about this, but hopefully you've all got a feeling of how that could be useful to you. It doesn't take that long to do once you get the basics, and the quick worksheet is obviously quicker again. And especially if it's a kind of an ordinary kind of an issue. Though sometimes you can find the ordinary issues bring up all sorts of stuff. As you say, the person who didn't turn up for lunch and you're furious, even though the issue isn't a big mega issue, but it can bring up stuff for you. Okay, the 4 steps, I did talk about those the last time. I just go over them very quickly. This is something you can memorize and do anytime. And this is one of the ones that's meant in your mind, usually. And it does bring you through the 5 steps, but just very quickly. And so say, for example, you're at a dinner or you're at a meeting and somebody says something, you feel you're just going to react. You could think in your own head, okay, look what I created. Now, it doesn't mean, you idiot, look what you created. It's look what I've co-created. Look what if I'm in this situation, I've had a part in it, is really what it's saying. I notice my judgments and feelings and love myself anyway. So you notice that you're annoyed. So you're not pretending you're not, but I accept the fact that I am. I am willing to see the perfection in the situation, and I choose the power of peace. It's amazing how effective this is. You may need to do it a few times. Colin used to work a lot with business people, and some of them told him when he went back to one group that this was the most powerful thing they had. That they could do this, like if they were at a board meeting and they were feeling annoyed, they could just do this and it would calm them down. Okay, so that's most of it. The 13 steps, we won't go into them now. I did them with them the last time. Some of them can be downloaded from audible.com. Self-forgiveness is another story, and I think we will do one on self-forgiveness at some point, because it's ultimately, all forgiveness is ultimately self-forgiveness. As you may find when you do the worksheet and you realize it was really about me all the time. It wasn't about them, quite often. The songs, I didn't play them this time, but there's some beautiful songs by Karen Taylor Good. I played them the last time. You can find her on YouTube, and she wrote the I Forgive You one during a workshop with Colin Tipping. And then there's just some further information. There's a new Colin Tipping himself has passed away, but somebody else has taken it over. And if you just look up Radical Forgiveness, you'll find it. Books by him are available on all the major places. There are YouTube interviews with him as well. And I think Audible have some of his stuff. I've done 3 interviews and they're all available on YouTube under my name. And that's my email address.